Many Americans are expected to vote by mail for the first time in the upcoming election due to concerns about the coronavirus. That continues a trend from 2016, where 33 million mail-in ballots were cast. Of those, some 73,000 arrived too late to be counted. CBS News estimates a little under 1% to nearly 2% of mail-in absentee ballots in 5 battleground states were rejected. That's just a glimpse of potential challenges for voters, campaigns, and election officials in the upcoming election. CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns and CBS News campaign reporter Adam Brewster join me now. Welcome, Caitlin and Adam. So, Caitlin, let's start with you. What are some of the common mistakes that voters typically make voting by mail, and what leads to a ballot actually being invalidated?
Hi, Elaine. Well, what we saw in the primaries this year that happened during the pandemic is that a lot of voters were casting ballots by mail for the first time because they didn't feel comfortable going to the polls. Every election official that we talk to says that they are expecting more and more Americans to be voting absentee, voting by mail in the November election. So there's going to be some kind of learning curve for a lot of voters who will be doing this for the first time. And the most common mistakes that we see, or the most common reasons for a ballot being rejected, is that it isn't signed, it doesn't have the signature can't be verified, or it doesn't arrive on time. So those are the 3 big issues that election officials and analysts and experts have been telling us to look out for. So voters should really be taking the time to look at the ballot, read it through and through. Some states have requirements that mandate a witness signature or a notary. So it's really important to look at all the directions. As you noted in the top, we looked at 5 key battleground states and what happened in the primaries during this year, and we saw that these rejection rates, they are pretty low. Most of the time your vote is counted, but in a very, very close election, and presidential races tend to be closer and closer these days, this could be one key issue of contention that could potentially delay results on election day.
So critical to read those instructions thoroughly. So, Adam, what are election officials doing to try to get ahead of some of these potential problems?
Education efforts that Caitlin just mentioned are critical, right? Teaching people the instructions that they need to follow so that those preventable mistakes, getting your ballot in on time, making sure you sign the right places, happen. So that is finding creative ways to do that messaging, making sure there are clear instructions that come with people's ballots, that they know how to fill that out right. Another part of it is messaging on how early you need to vote if you're going to be voting by mail. The Postal Service said in May it can take a week between the time your ballot is requested and the time it shows up at your home, and then it can take another week at least between the time you drop it in a mailbox and the time it arrives in an election office. So really you need to allow at least 2 weeks if you're going to vote entirely by mail. What you're seeing is some election officials pushing, when it gets closer, turn your ballot in person. The National Conference of State Legislatures says nearly every state lets you turn in your ballot at your local clerk's office. Many of the states set up drop boxes at clerk's offices or elsewhere around cities for people to return their ballots. Here in Michigan, a week before tomorrow's primary, the Secretary of State said, don't put your absentee ballots in the mail anymore if you have them. Go turn them in person because we want to make sure those ballots count. And one other thing that just is tangential to voting by mail is the criticalness of in-person voting options in November and the massive effort it's going to take to recruit new poll workers so that there are plenty of voting options available and plenty of staff at those options, at those voting locations, so that there are not long lines in the middle of a pandemic. That is something else that election officials are really worried about and laser focused on heading toward November.
And Adam, for people who aren't familiar with this process, how much does voting by mail actually vary from state to state?
Well, we have 50 states, so the simple answer is there's really 50 different systems. But you can categorize them into a few different buckets. There are 5 states that primarily conduct their elections by mail. That's Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, and Hawaii. There's about 30 states that let anyone vote absentee without needing an excuse. You don't need a reason. CBS News has counted another 7 states so far who have expanded absentee voting ahead of the November election because of the coronavirus pandemic, and others are still considering expanding that availability to people. But even within the variances of who is and isn't allowed to vote absentee or vote by mail, there are the things Caitlin mentioned. 11 states require a witness or a notary to sign your ballot, and then some states also require that witness to provide an address. That is something that, depending on where you live, is important. The deadlines also vary. Most states, you have to have your ballot in by the time polls close on Election Day. Some, it's earlier if it's an absentee ballot. Others just say, hey, your ballot needs to be postmarked by Election Day, and then it needs to arrive within a certain number of days later. Again, that varies by state. There are also differences in terms of who is mailing absentee ballot applications to all voters. It really is a state-by-state basis. It is important that people look up their local election information, go to their state Secretary of State's website. Many of them are very accessible and have those details laid out. But there are so many different systems and nuances which can lead to confusion because how your parents vote in one state may be different of how you vote in another state.
The president continues to raise questions about mail-in voting on a regular basis. Let's go ahead and listen to what he said last week.
Absentee ballots are secure and they're very good, but universal mail-in are a disaster. You're going to see an election and we're going to do very well in the election. Nobody wants that date more than me. I wish we'd move it up, okay? Move it up. But you're not prepared for what they're doing. They're not prepared. You watch. They're not going to announce anything on November 3rd. They're not going to announce it on the 4th or the 5th or the 6th. It'll go on forever.
Adam, let me turn to you. You're there in the battleground state of Michigan. Could that have an effect, perhaps?
What you're going to see is everyone knows that more people are going to be voting absentee, and people want those ballots to count. Michigan is one of those states I mentioned where they did mail absentee ballot applications to all 7+ million registered voters. It was a big contention between the president and the Secretary of State here, and she's faced some questions about that from Republicans in the state legislature. But everyone knows that if you do not have a plan for voting by mail or voting absentee, you're just leaving those votes on the table. So you can rely and try to juice turnout on Election Day. But if you're not able to capitalize and have a good strategy for your supporters filling out your absentee ballots, you may be leaving votes on the table from people who just are afraid to head to the polls.
All right, Adam Brewster, thank you. Our thanks as well to Caitlin Huey-Burns. Some really important reporting about how to make your vote count. All right, thank you so much.